I wasn't supposed to read it. My job was to scan, tag, and archive. Nothing more. I'm a graduate student working in a university lab that specializes in the history of science, mostly Cold War biomedical research. They have a partnership with a few Eastern European institutions, and recently we got a shipment of declassified Soviet documents, mostly chemistry reports, agricultural genetics. Boring stuff, honestly. Until I found one file that didn't belong. It wasn't in the database. It had no tag, just a handwritten note clipped to the cover. Project Viduna do not assess. For internal review only. No date, no stamp, no sender, just an off-white folder with odd weight to it. I should have passed it to my supervisor, but I didn't. I opened it. The first page was in Russian. I can read enough to get by. It looked like a proposal for something called genetic adaptation with behavioral vector. It sounded like nothing I'd ever seen. Like someone had tried to write a scientific paper in the language of alchemists. One sentence made me stop. Our goal is not biological superiority. It is to encode ideological alignment directly into the genetic code. I thought it was a metaphor, until I saw the diagrams. Crude genome maps, labeled in pencil. Small annotations in the margins. Isolation of Will inhibitors. Subconscious profile matching. Behavioral lock at generational level. I started scanning the pages without thinking. They described a method of editing DNA to remove certain emotional reactions. Fear of authority, hesitation, empathy. It didn't read like theory. It read like instructions. I looked at the date written in the footer of one page. May 1962. 1962. CRISPR wasn't even conceptualized until the late 1980s. And here was a Soviet file casually outlining directed gene expression to suppress behavioral deviation. I didn't sleep that night. The more I read, the more the language started to shift. At first, it was Soviet academic, formal, stiff, heavy with ideology. But then, it got technical, sharp, modern. One passage in particular hit too close. We have succeeded in segmenting targeted chromosomal zones associated with response, inhibition, and dominance. Control is possible if insertion is precise. It sounded impossible. Insertion, segmentation, in 1962. I double-checked the date. Again, 1962. There was no mention of CRISPR, obviously, but the process they described? It matched gene editing by guide sequence, like something written backwards through time. I pulled up a CRISPR case study I'd used in class. Side by side, the overlap was disturbing. Both talked about targeted sequence correction, behavioral outcome prediction, multi-generational trait anchoring. Even the diagrams were eerily similar. Crude in the Soviet file, yes, but the logic, it was the same. But that wasn't the worst part. On page 8, they described something called the refusal phase. It referred to test subjects who resisted the alignment, who retained unpredictability, free thought, or emotional disobedience. Their solution: suppression via hormonal vector, fallback, isolate and neutralize. No context, no ethics, just cold procedure. Suddenly this wasn't science. This was programming, not of computers, of people. At the bottom of that page, one line was underlined twice. Biological magic is obedience without memory. That's when I felt something shift. I wasn't reading research. I was reading the manual of an ideology, written in code, inside blood. And the scariest part? Some of those words: vector inhibition, ideological insertion, silence protein. I'd seen them in modern biotech papers, not word for word, but close enough to freeze me. And now I had a question I couldn't stop asking. Were we discovering this science? Or just rediscovering something that never truly disappeared? Buried in the middle of the file was a section labeled Field Results. It started with clinical language. Group A, improved obedience response at 36% activation threshold. Group B, emotional detachment successful in 8 of 10 cases. Group C, incomplete silencing, presented volatility. Then came the list of test groups, each one marked with a code name. Znamya 1 through Znamya 9. Znamya means banner in Russian. Like these people were meant to be carriers of something. There were no names, Just numbers, ages, sex, approximate genetic profile. Some were marked V, volunteer. Others, object. I knew what that meant. The descriptions started technical, then turned surreal. One subject, subject Z, for ceased verbal speech, but developed repeat vocalization of implanted key phrases. Another, subject Z, 7 displayed compulsive group alignment behavior, standing behind other subjects, mirroring posture without instruction. And one more, circled in red ink. Subject Z, 2 entered lucid state, reported sensation. My thoughts are not mine. That line made me stop breathing for a second. My thoughts are not mine. The entries continued. Some subjects overheated, psychological collapse, organ stress. Others were deemed locked, meaning their behavior became static, unchanging, predictable. One page summarized it like a breakthrough. Perfect obedience can be induced biologically. Ideology is not taught. It is implanted. I wasn't sure what disturbed me more, the success of the project, or how calmly they wrote about it. But then I hit a line that felt like a punch to the chest. At the end of one field report, someone had written, "The banner is preserved. The work can be resumed anywhere." That phrase kept repeating in my mind. The work can be resumed anywhere. And I started to understand what I was really reading. This wasn't history. It was a portable blueprint, something that could disappear for decades and return in the hands of anyone with the right tools. Like CRISPR, like modern biotech, like now. I didn't go to class the next morning. I didn't even sleep. The file was still spread across my desk, a mix of faded Cyrillic and diagrams that looked more like occult glyphs than science. The sun rose without me noticing. I sat in silence, rereading the same passages, highlighting fragments that sent chills down my spine. Not because they were absurd, but because they made too much sense. Somewhere around 6:40 a.m., I opened a browser tab and typed in the phrase, "Insertion of behavioral inhibitors via chromosomal targeting." What came up was a 2016 study from a Korean biotech lab experimenting with epigenetic silencing using CRISPR, a gene-activating method. The phrase they used was different, but the mechanism was identical. The Soviet file described a method of binding synthetic molecules to suppress emotional volatility in test subjects. The modern paper? Nearly the same, with updated language and prettier graphics. It was like someone had dusted off a blueprint and rebranded it as innovation. I started pulling other documents, current CRISPR-based gene therapy trials, behavioral genomics reviews, neurological studies. I wasn't looking for exact matches. I knew the Soviets didn't have the vocabulary we use today. But the structure of thought, the goals, identical. The Soviet file spoke in strange phrases: compliance encoding, submission mapping, pathway reinforcement. But when you stripped away the ideology, they translated eerily close to modern terms like neuroplastic reprogramming or emotion regulation gene editing. I opened a file from our university's 2023 Ethics Board report. It mentioned a proposal to explore how CRISPR could be used to enhance cooperative behavioral baselines in high-risk populations. Enhance, cooperative, baselines, same goal, cleaner language. The more I read, the more I noticed patterns. One Soviet page included a molecular diagram labeled the S code. I cross-referenced it with a 2021 diagram from a DARPA-funded project working on neural pathway interventions. They matched, not in detail, but in form. The loops, the trigger points, the feedback loops tied to emotional stimulus. The Soviet chart was a prototype. The DARPA diagram was version 2.0. I'm not saying they copied it, but if someone had access to that Soviet material, and if they continued the work in secret, this is exactly what it would evolve into. Around 9 a.m., I got a call from my advisor. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to tell anyone. Not yet, because there was one more thing. A term that came up multiple times in the Soviet documents. The closest English translation is fading or dampening. It showed up in the context of memory, language, and, strangely, identity. One line read, "The subject exhibits a hanie of autobiographical detail, feels emotions disconnected from narrative context. I searched modern literature for this phenomenon and found something called dissociative memory detachment, a condition where emotional responses are preserved, but disconnected from the memories that caused them. It's being studied right now in trauma therapy and, surprisingly, in experimental military training. According to one paper from 2019, DARPA had invested in research to create resilience to psychological stress through targeted memory modulation. Sounds useful until you realize what it actually means. Teaching someone to feel fear, anger, motivation without remembering why, conditioned emotion, triggered without reason, obedience without thought. I was starting to see the edges of something horrifying. CRISPR was never marketed as mind control. It was about curing diseases, fixing broken genes, hope. But in these papers, and in the Soviet file, I saw a different dream. Not to heal, but to design. To write new humans the way you write software. I sat back and stared at the screen. Tabs open, notes everywhere, my breathing shallow. I checked the folder again. Inside, tucked into a separate sleeve, was a list of phrases written in English, the only part not in Russian. Handwritten. No explanation. Just a column of terms. Thought latching, obedience threading, command priming, silencer harmonics, predictive orientation. I Googled each one. Some came back with obscure references in experimental AI behavior control. Others, nothing at all. The phrase silencer harmonics showed up only once in a 2018 patent filed by a defense contractor for non-lethal behavioral modulation systems. I felt sick. It wasn't science fiction. It wasn't history. It was right here, scattered across declassified archives and modern PDFs, hiding in plain sight under the name of progress. I kept hearing one line in my head, like an echo from the Soviet file. Magic is only science you haven't yet made obedient. And now we're making it obedient, line by line, code by code, genome by genome. That night, I deleted my search history, backed everything up to an encrypted drive. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I also printed out 3 copies of what I found. And I didn't write my name on any of them. I didn't go back to the archive. Officially, I told my lab supervisor I had the flu. He didn't ask questions. He sounded distracted, almost like he expected me to disappear. Unofficially, I spent the next 72 hours in my apartment, curtains drawn, phone on silent, just reading. And the more I read, the more I realized I wasn't discovering something new. I was watching something ancient put on a new face. I organized everything I had, scanned pages, notes, screenshots, patent records. I laid it out like an investigation, trying to build a timeline. 1960s, Soviet program Viduna begins, genetic targeting, behavioral rewiring, pre-CRISPR ideation. 1970s, 90s, silence. Early 2000s, new terminology appears, behavioral modulation, neurogenetic interface. 2010s, CRISPR becomes the golden child of modern biotech. Now the same phrases, same effects, different language. I wasn't paranoid. I was late. The phrase I kept coming back to from the Soviet file. The banner is preserved. The work can be resumed anywhere. That's not how you talk about a program. That's how you talk about a formula. Something portable, transferable, a seed, not a conspiracy, a methodology. One night, I pulled up archived footage from the 1990s. Interviews with defected Soviet scientists, people who worked on psychotronic research. Most were brushed off as cranks. But one man, a biophysicist named Antonov, mentioned something strange. There was a project that made people believe they were loyal. Not through propaganda, through something in their blood. We were told it was a metaphor. It wasn't. He laughed after he said it. A broken laugh. Then he looked straight at the camera and said, "One day, they won't even need flags. Just code." The interview was never aired. It sat in a university archive, buried in a mislabeled box. How do I know? Because it was referenced in a 1998 internal memo I found scanned online, by accident. I made a new column in my notes, Cultural Echoes. 1964, Soviet science fiction novel mentions personality grafting. banned in Moscow the same year. 1977. A leaked CIA document references genetic loyalty applications in adversarial populations. 1985. Unconfirmed reports of orphanage-based gene trials in East Germany. 1992. Private Swiss biotech firm patents a sequence nearly identical to S-code model. It was everywhere, but never in one place, like a trail built to never connect. Until now. Then I remembered something my professor once said about CRISPR. It's not just a tool. It's a language, and language is culture. If that's true, then CRISPR isn't the invention. It's the interface. The invention was the idea. That people are programmable. That identity is editable. That ideology can be printed. I started looking at biotech companies, current ones, some publicly traded, some privately owned with shady backers. One had a mission statement that included the phrase, building resilience into the human mind from the genome up. Another said, behavioral stability through neurological alignment. Alignment, that word again. I found it in the Soviet papers too, in a quote from a lead researcher. We do not create loyalty. We align the mind until loyalty becomes indistinguishable from the self. I wrote that one down. I couldn't stop staring at it. It didn't sound like science. It sounded like philosophy with a scalpel. Here's the part that still keeps me up at night. I thought this was about the past, about what they tried and failed to do. But then I looked at a 2022 clinical trial run by a company in California. They were testing gene therapies for trauma reduction. On the list of objectives, suppress involuntary panic response, reduce long-term memory sensitivity to violent images, increase emotional compliance to verbal commands. Verbal commands. What kind of trauma therapy needs that? I kept digging, and I found a document I was never supposed to see. It was buried in an online repository of white papers for defense R&D. Not classified, but not public-facing either. Title: Genomic Conditioning for Strategic Environments. Inside, references to genetic compliance agents, mentions of psychosocial encoding, sections labeled non-lethal obedience augmentation, and in the appendix, one phrase repeated again and again. The work can be resumed anywhere. It wasn't a Soviet phrase. It was in English, and the document was dated 2020. This isn't technology evolving. This is memory repeating. We didn't invent CRISPR. We just dressed it up, cleaned the blood off the pages, and called it treatment. But the intention, the dream, still the same. To build minds that don't rebel, hearts that don't resist, voices that never ask why. And I think the most terrifying part is that we call it progress. I don't know what to do with all of this. I haven't told anyone. I probably won't. But I printed everything. 3 copies, stored in 3 separate places. Because if I disappear, someone should know what's being repeated. Not for history, for warning, for the next person who thinks they're just scanning files, until they realize the file is scanning them back. I was ready to let it go. After everything I'd seen, the Soviet files, the CRISPR overlap, the defense documents, my mind was already stretched thin. I was sleeping 3 hours a night, double-checking the locks, unplugging my router, thinking about burning the printed copies more than once. But then the system made its move first. Monday morning, 8:02 a.m., I tried to log in to the university archive server. My credentials didn't work. At first I thought it was a glitch. Maybe I mistyped. I reset my password. No recovery email. The system didn't even recognize my username anymore. Then I got the message. A simple automated email. Your archival access has been permanently revoked under Protocol 7B. Please contact your department supervisor for further clarification. Protocol 7B. I'd never heard of it. I asked one of the senior archivists about it in person. He looked at me like I just said something dangerous. Where did you see that? I told him the system sent it. He nodded, said nothing, and walked away. That's when I realized this wasn't about internal rules. This was about pressure. I went back to the file room, the one where I'd originally found the Viduna folder. Gone. Not just the file, the drawer, the entire row of cabinets, replaced with newer models, clean, labeled, full of agricultural data. I checked the logbook. There was no record of any reorganization, no mention of the folder, nothing to suggest that what I found had ever existed, except for one thing. I'd kept a file number written in my notebook. I showed it to a tech assistant and asked if it was still in the system. He typed it in, blinked, then said, "That block of IDs doesn't exist anymore." I asked him when it was removed. He paused. 3 days ago. 3 days. The day I started cross-referencing CRISPR patents. I still had one card left, my laptop. But that night, something strange happened. The moment I opened a folder with my scanned Soviet pages, the screen glitched. Just for a second. A flicker. Then the folder was empty. Every file had been renamed. Unopenable. No preview. No file size. I checked the backups. Same thing. It was like someone, or something, had scrubbed every digital trace remotely. I should have panicked. I didn't, because I had one thing they couldn't erase. The page I copied by hand. It wasn't one of the technical pages. It wasn't even important looking, but it stuck with me. It was a fragment, part of a transcript, a conversation between two unnamed researchers. If we embed compliance too deeply, it won't look like obedience. It'll look like nature. That's the point. People won't resist their own biology. But what if memory recovers? It won't. Memory is an overlay. We just change the background. The last line was underlined twice. Make the illusion stable, and they'll never ask who built the frame. I didn't know what that meant at first. Now I do. The illusion isn't the science. It's the belief that the science is new, that we're just now discovering how to reprogram life. But someone decades ago already knew, already tested it, already buried it. And now, as CRISPR labs pop up across the world, with marketing campaigns and TED Talks and ethical oversight, they're just putting a new label on an old project. I've started seeing things differently since then. The way language shifts, the way tech companies describe emotional intelligence in machines, the way social platforms nudge behavior, the way medications alter mood, and how genetic tests ask you to donate your data. It's not all the same thing, but it's the same impulse, the same dream. To make obedience feel voluntary. They revoked my clearance, but they can't revoke what I saw, what I copied, what I now understand. And that's why I wrote this, not as proof, not as evidence, but as warning. In case you ever stumble on something like I did, in case you ever think, "That's strange, this looks too familiar." Trust your gut. Take a copy. Hide it. Because if they find it first, you'll never even know it was gone. I used to believe science had boundaries. You needed a hypothesis, peer review, ethics boards, journals, oversight. That's what separated it from madness, from power. But what I read, and what I lived through, had no rules, because it was never meant to be science. It was something else entirely. I kept thinking about the phrase I found in the transcript. Make the illusion stable, and they'll never ask who built the frame. That wasn't just about subjects. It was about all of us. We live in that illusion of progress, of autonomy, of self. But the more I peeled back, the more I saw how deeply the frame was built. And it wasn't built by accident. It was engineered. I started looking beyond CRISPR. What if it's not just genetic tools that are repeating history? What if the entire system of control, tech, politics, medicine, education, is running the same code? I found a 2021 presentation from a neuroadaptive interface company. They were developing wearable devices that monitor emotional compliance in team environments. Let that phrase sink in. Emotional compliance. The presentation showed heat maps of group cohesion drift and real-time emotional response to leadership prompts. They called it innovation, but in the Soviet documents, I found nearly the same diagrams. Only back then, they didn't call it innovation. They called it reconstruction. Even marketing is part of the frame. One pharmaceutical company ran a campaign about bringing balance to your biology. Their flagship product? A gene therapy targeting mood volatility. In a footnote, originally explored in state-funded cognitive stability programs, archival models unavailable. Of course they're unavailable. I know where they went, and still no one notices, because everything is dressed in the language of care. improvement, optimization, mental wellness, resilience. But no one asks, resilient to what? Wellness by whose standard? What are we being optimized for? No one asks, because science has earned trust. But this wasn't science. Not the kind you write papers about. This was ritual with equations. Here's what I realized. Science wants to understand the world. Power wants to write it. And this wasn't understanding. It was writing people, designing minds. One of the last notes in the Soviet file was barely legible, smeared in ink, like someone tried to erase it. The final version will require no permission, no consent. It will feel like nature. It will be nature. That's the dream, isn't it? Not to force obedience, but to grow it, to plant it in your genome like a seed. So by the time you bloom, you can't imagine being anything else. I used to think mind control looked like machines, torture, wires, blinking lights. Now I know better. Mind control looks like peace, like focus, like motivation, like a good day, but only because someone wrote the script you now follow. I'm not saying every biotech company is part of this. I'm not saying every gene therapy is dangerous, but I am saying this. We crossed the line between discovery and design decades ago. We just stopped acknowledging it. And the silence, it isn't ignorance, it's compliance. I've gone quiet, not out of fear, not exactly, but because I think I crossed a threshold I didn't know existed. There's a difference between finding something hidden and finding something that was meant to stay buried. What I saw wasn't just classified, it was structurally forgotten, built to vanish, designed to dissolve in plain sight. And I wasn't supposed to catch it, but I did. I keep thinking about how I found the Viduna file in the first place. It wasn't part of the shipment manifest. It wasn't tagged, indexed, or digitized. It was just there, almost like it had been left behind deliberately. But why? As a test, a leak, or a message? Because the more I think about it, the more I realize I wasn't the first to read it. I was just the first one who didn't look away. Since then, things feel wrong. Not they're watching me wrong. Worse, like the world around me is bending, like something is watching, but not through eyes, through pattern. I open apps and see ads for memory supplements. My news feed shows articles on behavioral predictability and neural loyalty training. My inbox receives emails from biotech firms I've never subscribed to. One invited me to a webinar titled, Engineering Obedience, Psychology Meets Precision Medicine. Coincidence? Probably. But after what I've read, probably doesn't comfort me anymore. Even my body feels different, heavier, like I've become noticeable to the system I stepped into. And maybe I have. I started dreaming of rooms I've never seen. Rooms without doors, but with voices. They say things like, real compliance is forgetting you were ever separate. The new species won't remember the old questions. Silence is the trait of the improved. I wake up sweating, but with no fear, just understanding, like my own mind is starting to agree with them. I've stopped trusting mirrors. Sometimes, when I look at my reflection too long, I feel like something else is looking back, asking, have you aligned yet? What scares me isn't that I read the file. It's that the file may have read me. What if this wasn't an archive? What if this was a signal, a remnant designed to trigger those capable of understanding? What if they never intended to erase the knowledge, just to hide it until the right minds evolved enough to decode it? If that's true, I wasn't meant to find this. Not now. Maybe not ever. Because there's one thought I can't shake. What if Viduna was never decommissioned? What if it just changed form, dispersed like vapor through research labs, data centers, training models, waiting for those like me to open the wrong door and become part of it? Not enemies, not obstacles, just updated nodes. I don't know what I am anymore. A whistleblower? A carrier? A mistake? But I know one thing. This wasn't supposed to be found. And now that I have, it's not done with me. I started testing the idea. Not in a lab. I don't have one anymore. But out there, in the open, in conversations, in crowds, in how people react to ideas. I'd casually mention something, a phrase from the Viduna files, a term like behavioral anchor or cooperative restructuring. Most people didn't notice. But some stopped, blinked, tilted their heads like they'd just remembered something they were supposed to forget. One guy, a researcher from a biotech meetup, repeated the word compliance harmonics back to me, then laughed and said, "Where did you hear that? That's not public-facing yet." Not public-facing, but it exists. I'm not imagining this. There's a rhythm to how the world responds now. Subtle, controlled, predictable. It's in how articles are headlined, how people finish each other's sentences online, how certain ideas become normal overnight, without votes, without debate, like something running in the background, like an OS update for reality. I walked past a digital billboard in the city last week. The ad flashed so fast I almost missed it. A pharmaceutical promo. One phrase in the corner. Regulate thought. Restore balance. It was gone in half a second. No one else noticed, but I did. Because that phrase, regulate thought, was on page 17 of the Soviet file. Verbatim. What if Viduna didn't end? What if it was never even isolated? What if the system now runs distributed, built into corporate psychology programs, biotech wellness protocols, digital behavior modeling, AI emotion training, even education? Not obvious, just embedded, like DNA. I looked deeper. An AI development firm I'd never heard of, Simtric BioOps, has a patent for behavioral sculpting via genetic priming plus algorithmic suggestion layers. What does that even mean? I tried searching their founders. No photos, no LinkedIn. The domain was registered offshore, yet they're contracted by multiple government human performance agencies. Everywhere I look, I see the same words: alignment, harmony, resilience, stability, but never freedom, never questioning. Last night, I got an email from someone I don't know. No subject line, no Zenda Nama, just 2 lines. You're not wrong. You're just early. And a file attached. Nodes _updated_03.bin. I didn't open it. Not yet. Because I'm afraid it's not a warning. I'm afraid it's an instruction. My ears ring sometimes now. Only at certain frequencies. I hear tones in silence. Short, patterned, rhythmic. They stop when I notice them. My dreams are changing too. People talking without mouths. Eyes with no face. Symbols I now recognize, but can't name. One dream kept repeating. A circle of chairs in a white room. Each one filled, except the one in the center. When I walk toward it, I hear, "You passed the threshold. Now sit." I haven't told anyone, because I don't know if they'd listen. Or worse, if they already can't. I used to think truth was enough. But this isn't a truth that wants to be known. This is a live system, one that adapts, that watches who watches it, and corrects accordingly, like an immune response. What if this was the test? Not to read the file, but to react to it. And now that I have, I've been flagged. Not by an agency, not by a person, by the system itself. So I stopped looking, but it hasn't stopped watching. I've stopped writing everything down. It doesn't matter now. Not because I gave up, not because I was wrong, but because I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. This isn't a story you tell. It's a story you leave. I used to think the truth could change something, that if people knew, they'd resist. But I was wrong, because this isn't a prison built with bars. It's a structure of belief, self-sustaining, self-correcting, a system that doesn't need to hide, because it's everywhere you trust. Your doctor, your therapist, your algorithm, your DNA kit. They're not evil. They're not even aware. They're just parts of the same dream, the one that began with a Soviet diagram and now lives in biotech startups and UX design manuals. The final line in the Viduna file, the one no one else saw, still echoes in my mind. When control feels like nature, no one asks where it came from. The last layer of obedience is silence. And now I understand. The system doesn't need you to obey. It just needs you to stop asking. So I've stopped digging. Not because I fear them, but because I finally realized they're not listening. Because they don't have to. Because you're already aligned. Because you've already opted in. Through your clicks, your preferences, your DNA swabs, your terms and conditions. You were never asked for consent. You were designed to believe you gave it. This isn't an ending. There is no ending. There is only saturation. And once saturation is complete, once every variation has been mapped, every anomaly tagged, every descent modeled, there will be no more rebellion, no more questions, no more noise, just silence. So I'm leaving this, not for the authorities, not for exposure, but for you, the one who still feels something off, who still flinches at perfect symmetry, who still pauses when language sounds too coordinated. This message isn't to wake the world. It's to remind you that you're not crazy. You're not alone. You're just awake, in a system built for sleepers. I won't write again, because I've said what had to be said, and the rest is yours. Obedience doesn't begin with fear. It begins with forgetting you had another choice. If you remember anything, remember that.